My name is Stella, and I am 27 years old. I never imagined that one dinner, one sentence, and one title spoken out loud would turn my entire family dynamic upside down. But that's exactly what happened. And it all started weeks before the night everyone remembers. My sister had always been the golden one, the planner, the one who fit perfectly into expectations, while I was the quiet observer, the one who learned early that sometimes silence is safer than explaining yourself. When she got engaged, the family group chat exploded with excitement. Venues, menus, and rehearsals. And I stayed mostly invisible, replying with short congratulations and polite emojis. Then one afternoon, my phone buzzed, with a message from my sister that felt heavier than all the wedding plans combined. "Don't come to the rehearsal," she wrote. "Jason's dad is a federal judge. We can't have you embarrassing us." I stared at the screen, my thumb frozen, my chest tightening. Not because I was angry, but because I realized how little she truly knew me. I didn't reply. I never do when silence says more. In my mind, I replayed that sentence again and again. Jason's dad is a federal judge, as if that alone explained everything. As if power was something that could only flow in one direction. I told myself it didn't matter, that I had chosen a life where my work stayed separate from my family, where my title didn't define my relationships. But the truth was, it still stung. I showed up to family dinners less, kept my schedule vague, and let my sister believe whatever version of me made her comfortable. The night of the engagement dinner finally arrived, and despite everything, I went, not to prove anything, but because my parents asked me to, and because part of me still hoped for normalcy. The restaurant was elegant. All soft lighting and polished silverware, the kind of place where conversations are carefully curated and laughter never gets too loud. I arrived early, took my seat, and nodded politely as relatives trickled in, feeling like an outsider at my own family's table. My sister avoided my eyes, her fiancé smiled stiffly, and I could almost hear the unspoken warning hanging in the air. "Behave, don't stand out. Don't remind anyone you're different." I said nothing. I listened as they talked about wedding colors, guest lists, and how impressive Jason's father was. How respected, how powerful. How everyone should be on their best behavior tonight. Each time his name came up, my sister's voice carried a strange mix of pride and fear, as if she was borrowing importance instead of owning it. I kept my posture relaxed, my expression neutral, and my hands folded neatly on the table, aware that every move I made was being silently evaluated. Then the door to the restaurant opened, and the energy shifted instantly. Conversations paused, chairs stilled, and a hush rolled across the room like a wave. A man stepped inside, confident but unassuming, scanning the room with calm authority. Someone whispered, "That must be him," and my sister straightened, her fork trembling slightly in her hand. The man walked closer, greeted a few people, and then his eyes met mine. For a brief second, recognition flashed, followed by something warmer, respect. He stopped walking. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. He smiled and said clearly and calmly, "Judge Rivera?" The room went silent. My sister's fork dropped onto her plate, with a sharp clink that sounded louder than it should have. Every face turned toward me, confusion spreading like wildfire. But I didn't react, not yet. I simply looked back at him and nodded slightly, as if this was the most normal thing in the world. Inside, my thoughts were steady, grounded, because this moment wasn't about revenge or humiliation. It was about truth surfacing when no one expects it. I could feel my sister's shock beside me, her carefully constructed narrative collapsing in real time, but I kept my voice calm, my presence composed. In that instant, the words she had sent me weeks ago echoed louder than any conversation in the room. "We can't have you embarrassing us." And I realized how often people mistake humility for weakness, silence for insignificance, and how dangerous it can be to underestimate someone simply because they don't announce who they are. If you want to know what happened next, how that single title changed everything, how respect shifted, and how my sister was forced to confront the truth she never bothered to learn, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now, because this story is just getting started. The moment Judge Harrison said, "Judge Rivera," the air at the table changed so sharply it felt like pressure in my ears. And I finally understood how fragile, unearned confidence can be when it's built on assumptions. My sister's face drained of color as she stared at me, her eyes searching my expression for a punchline that never came, while Jason shifted uncomfortably in his chair, suddenly unsure where to place his hands or his gaze. Around us, whispers began to ripple, subtle at first, then louder, people repeating the words under their breath as if saying them again might make them make sense. Judge Rivera, Your Honor. I could almost see the mental recalculations happening in real time. The way people reframe, you when a title enters the room before you ever announced it yourself. Judge Harrison smiled politely, pulled out a chair across from me, and sat down as if this had been planned all along, greeting my parents warmly before turning back to me and saying, I didn't realize you were family. His tone respectful, measured, the same tone he used in court. I replied just as evenly, acknowledging him. And that was when the weight of the situation fully settled over the table. My sister opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again, forcing a laugh that sounded brittle. Stella, you never told us, she said. And there it was, the accusation hidden inside confusion, as if my silence had been a betrayal rather than a choice. I met her eyes calmly, feeling years of restraint anchoring me, and said softly, You never asked. That single sentence seemed to land harder than any raised voice could have. The waiter arrived, paused, clearly sensing the tension, and awkwardly asked if anyone needed anything, breaking the spell just enough for people to start moving again, adjusting napkins, sipping water, pretending normalcy hadn't just cracked wide open. As dinner resumed, the conversation shifted away from wedding colors and seating charts to law, public service, and responsibility, topics I was intimately familiar with but had never shared at this table before. Judge Harrison asked thoughtful questions, not to test me but to genuinely engage, and each answer I gave was careful, professional, and intentionally unshowy. I wasn't there to prove superiority. I was there because I belonged, even if they hadn't realized it until now. My sister barely touched her food, her fork lying abandoned after it had dropped earlier. The image burned into my mind like the words from that text she sent me. Don't come to the rehearsal. Jason's dad is a federal judge. I wondered if she could hear them now, echoing back at her in a different light. Jason tried to recover, complimenting my career, calling it impressive, but the word felt hollow, like praise given out of obligation rather than understanding. My parents sat quietly, processing their own shock, pride flickering behind their restraint, perhaps realizing how much of my life I had kept compartmentalized to protect this fragile family balance. Throughout the meal, people addressed me differently, their posture shifting, their voices lowering slightly when they spoke to me, and that change made me uncomfortable in a way I hadn't expected. I had worked hard to be respected for my judgment, my integrity, not for the title alone, and seeing how quickly perception flipped was a sobering reminder of how power distorts authenticity. At one point, my sister leaned toward me and whispered, "Why didn't you tell me?" And for the first time that night, emotion crept into my voice as I replied just as quietly, "Because every time I tried to be myself, you told me to be less." She recoiled slightly, not out of anger but recognition, and I knew that sentence would stay with her long after the dinner ended. The rest of the evening unfolded with forced politeness, but underneath it ran an undeniable shift. Respect mingled with embarrassment, admiration tangled with regret. As we stood to leave, Judge Harrison shook my hand again and said, "It's good to see you outside the courtroom. Your Honor?" loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. And I noticed my sister flinch at the words, not because of their authority, but because of what they represented, a truth she had dismissed. Walking out of the restaurant, the cool night air felt grounding, and for the first time since that text message weeks ago, I felt something close to relief. I hadn't raised my voice, I hadn't defended myself aggressively, and I hadn't needed to explain my worth. The title had spoken, the silence had answered, and the room had gone silent for a reason. What none of them realized yet was that this dinner was only the beginning, because titles can command attention, but consequences demand reflection, and the real conversation with my sister was still waiting to happen. The days after that dinner were quieter than I expected, almost unnervingly so, as if the shock had drained the noise out of our family and left, behind only unspoken thoughts and unfinished sentences. My sister didn't call right away, and I didn't chase her. Because some realizations need space to grow before they can be spoken out loud. When she finally asked to meet, it wasn't at a fancy restaurant or over a family gathering, but at a small cafe we used to visit when we were younger, back when titles didn't exist, and we only argued about borrowed clothes and stolen secrets. She sat across from me, nervous, twisting her cup in her hands, and for the first time, she looked at me not as the risk she needed to manage, but as someone she might actually need to understand. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, and I could tell this apology wasn't about the embarrassment at dinner, but about years of assumptions layered one on top of another. She admitted that she had been afraid of not measuring up, afraid of standing next to someone whose accomplishments she didn't fully grasp, afraid that my presence would somehow expose her own insecurities. Listening to her, I felt no urge to interrupt, no desire to remind her of the text message, or the dropped fork or the silence in the room. I simply let her speak, because growth sounds a lot like discomfort before it sounds like change. I told her that I never hid my life out of shame, but out of self-preservation, that I learned early how quickly family dynamics can turn competitive when comparisons are invited in. I explained that being a judge wasn't about power to me. It was about responsibility, restraint, and knowing when to speak and when to stay quiet. She nodded slowly, tears gathering in her eyes, finally understanding that my silence had never been a threat, only a boundary. When we left the cafe, something between us had shifted, not magically fixed, but honest. And that honesty felt more valuable than approval ever could. The wedding rehearsal went on without me, just as she had asked weeks earlier. But this time the reason wasn't fear. It was respect for the space we were both still learning to navigate. On the day of the wedding, I attended as a guest, not as a secret or an embarrassment, but as myself. And when Jason's father greeted me again with "Your Honor," my sister smiled instead of flinching. That small moment told me everything I needed to know. Families don't always mean malice when they misunderstand you. Sometimes they mean fear wrapped in familiarity. The real lesson of that night wasn't that titles command silence, but that truth, when it arrives unannounced, has a way of resetting the room. If this story made you think, if it reminded you that your worth doesn't need constant explanation, and if you believe that quiet strength can speak louder than arrogance, then don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful, real-life inspired stories like this one. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need them most. And sometimes, hearing someone else's truth gives us the courage to finally own our own.